when I speak with people about psychedelics in general, there's a lot to it. There's the history of it. There's the study of consciousness. There's also the study of it with, as you say, with religion, and a better understanding of how the two make sense of one another. And I really like that aspect of your work. Would you say that's probably the primary focus that turned you on when you got into it? Was that the initial thing that launched you into really focusing on psychedelics? Was the history of it and kind of the human behavior around it, and the mystical aspect that seems to consistently be evoked, even though nowadays we're talking a lot more about like neurochemicals and the brain chemistry, and how this could be medicine, and microdosing to adjust if you have anxiety and depression. There's so many more conversations now that is kind of washing out some of the religious aspect of it. Is that what launched you into this study?
Yes, it is. I mean, I was, I'm 64 years old, so I was a young teenager as the 60s were getting going. And but I was a natural mystic from the time I was a young child. I had a spontaneous mystical experience in nature when I was about 11 or 12 years old that changed my perception of the world. And then psychedelic drugs kind of flooded into our society. And I was interested in them, but not as someone that wanted to take them. I was kind of frightened by them, but it was hard not to pay attention to what was going on. But it wasn't until about my third year of college, when I was, after I'd learned a little bit about meditation, and I wanted to understand, how did ancient people come up with meditation, these simple and profound technologies and cosmologies and worldviews? How did they come up with this stuff? And so I began to study the history of religion, and I learned that psychedelic drugs played a role in the very dawning of religion in human history. And so that really fascinated me, and a light went off, and I just dove right in. And I realized that my previous years, where I had come to regard psychedelic drugs as kind of trivial and recreational, and I hadn't really seen anybody benefit from them very much. So that conversation, that lecture that my professor at Columbia shared with us, that the Soma of the ancient Rig Veda, the oldest body of writings in Indian religion, was probably a mushroom. And he mentioned Gordon Wasson's name, and I just went, whoa. So I was a very thirsty scholar, I like to say, and I started to read and just dove in, and that's where it happened. But even, I wanted to say this, even within the history of religion, there are so many different ways to go with the phenomena of religion. I mean, we can talk about mysticism, we can talk about the experience, we can talk about the esoteric realm of religion, but there's also the psychology of religion and the history of religion, and religion's role in politics and in literature. And so psychedelic drugs are a microcosm of this. And again, we could go in any number of directions here. We can talk about the mystical aspects, the experiences of it. We can talk about the political forces behind them. How do drugs serve or undermine political structures? Religion is a force that's been used to, enlighten and inform humanity and direct it with its ethical systems and sense of human fulfillment and things like that. But it's also a force that's used to control populations and subjugate them and offer rationales for political activity. And so these are all, again, part of psychedelics. And I know your work covers a lot of these realms, so you could go anywhere here.
Yeah, for sure. So I guess first thing that comes up for me is it makes perfect sense to me that psychedelics are such a fundamental catalyst for religions, just about all of them. And back into the work of Chris Bennett, Michael Crowley, there's quite a few other people that I've studied that speak about going back into the history of it and showing that it seems quite obvious that psychedelics were the sacraments that we're speaking about and gave rise to these religions. So I guess my question is how did we forget? How did it become this thing that scholars now have to uncover and rediscover these origins?
Well, that's a huge and interesting question, and there are probably many different answers, and we'd have to focus on a particular example. So I mentioned soma, for example. That's the soma is the plant substance that was used to ignite the religions of India. You know, there were thousands of years ago, 3,000-4,000 years ago, Indian sages would go out and collect a plant they identified as soma that Gordon Wasson identified as an Amanita muscaria mushroom. The scholarly community is by no means unanimous in agreeing with that interpretation. There are many others that are offered, but in history, soma, we don't really know why it disappeared. Did the climate change? Did the people move on? Was the political control of soma so severe that the secret became lost? We don't really know. In some cases, the use of plants were clearly forbidden by a priestly class or by political structures. So, for example, you know, the 2,000 years of Christian history as so-called Christianity began to take over Europe. Any competing religious culture was eliminated. You know, we know about the Inquisition and the witch burning. So anybody that deemed to practice some other form of religion was burned at the stake or so on. So there's that. You know, in other cultures, indigenous cultures, the use of these plants is more or less continuous. In South America, for example, with ayahuasca and a number of the other ones, those uses have continued. So it's a big question, and you know, whichever way you really want to go, these are research projects for people.
For sure. And even in like the history of India, so there's so much nuance to it, because my question would be, well, was it the Aryan invasion? Because soma existed beforehand. And there's some people who discount that there was ever an invasion. There were Aryans living in India prior to that time, and that there was some kind of an upset at a certain point in history. I guess the question specifically about that is because it almost seems that when a new religion comes in, or let's say when an older religion turns into some kind of sanctioned authoritative structure, that these things that would have been like, you know, possibly accessible to, you know, maybe not anyone, but around there, like if you were to have known what the plant was, and you said that potentially soma, whatever that plant was, would have been illegal, that power structures may have come in and wanted to keep those resources for themselves as prized resources, sacraments that only we have, you know, connections with the gods, because a lot of, you know, the ancient kings and pharaohs would claim that as being their source of authority, is having the divine connection with God. So that was kind of where that question came in. And also, I mean, you're definitely right. It's super nuanced, because then you go to the Eleusinian mysteries that lasted, what, 2,000 years? Yes. And how did that disappear?
Well, see, that's another example, you know, and we're bringing up the subject here of secrecy and control, and Eleusis is one of the most interesting examples, because here is a culture that went on. Many people consider it the longest continuous use of a practice of a mystery religion involving a sacrament, an entheogen. It went on for 2,000 or so years. The beginnings are unclear. And people were forbidden to even talk about what went on during that sacred night of the vision.
Right.
And so awesome was the vision that almost nobody for this long period ever even spoke it. And so this is something, you know, like, as you mentioned, maybe this is because the priestly class was controlling it for their own power. That's one set of reasons for secrecy. Another set of reasons for secrecy may be to keep something from becoming profaned. You know, there's, like, for example, there's a body of writings, I'm sure you know, in India, the Upanishads. Okay, now the Upanishads are mystical teachings. And what Upanishad means in Sanskrit is something like to sit near. So it means that you sit near your teacher and he imparts this message to you at that time and only for you at that time, because that information about, I'm just taking an example, you know, the oneness of life, that may be useful for one person at one time, but not so useful for another person at another time. You know, you'll see this in different peyote sects and places. So the secrecy may have a positive aspect in that it's preserving the sacredness and preventing abuse of the sacrament. It may also have a political kind of a negative, control-oriented. So, you know, we got to look at these things specifically and individually.
I'm curious about, with the Eleusinian mysteries, is it true that only women were allowed to be the priests that gave the sacrament in Greece? Or was it women and men were allowed?
To actually administer it?
Right. Because I know I'm trying to remember in Brian Rescue's book, Immortality Key, I think he talked about this. And I'm just trying to wonder if as you see more of the male and the patriarchal element of Christianity changed more towards that, a patriarch and male priest class, if there's any correlation between, as more of the Mother Magdalene and the feminine elements was taken out of those teachings, that was all sort of part of it. I mean, I don't know if there is any strong direct connection, but it seems like as you see this shifting period and the Roman Catholic Church start to rise and gain more and more power geopolitically, you also see these Gnostic and these ancient teachings be more and more diminished, and this idea of only finding spirituality or connection to God through a church or an institution or a certain figurehead. And this is the whole thing, is this was a direct connection. And I think that certain people would be intimidated or see that as a threat to their, you know, more structured institution.
Well, the first part of your question is a specific detail that I don't know right now if that's true, if that only women were allowed to administer it. I do know that the scholars that are experts on this, that one of the things that distinguished Eleusis from the other several mystery cults of that time is that they were not only open for everyone, women, slaves. Once you were 13 or 14 years old, you were actually required to become an initiate of the cult. And as long as you hadn't killed anybody, that was the only stipulation. And so, you know, women were allowed, and that was a big thing, because in spite of the goddesses and so on in the Greek pantheon, you know, women were just above slaves in terms of status.
Right.
And they were allowed and entitled and required actually to take part in the mysteries.
That's interesting. So we're mentioning the Immortality Key, Brian Marescu. And I know that you had recently reached out to him. Is that right, Robert?
Yeah, we've had a little bit of contact, Brian, and not as much as I would like just yet. I'd really love to have a conversation with him, but I'm extra delighted that to see his book, because he got the idea to do this research when he came upon this book here.
Right.
So he mentioned this book throughout his The Immortality Key, And this is really one of my most ambitious projects. So let's talk about this for just a second. In fact, we'll circle back around and get to, oh, look, here's a letter.
And just for the audience who will be listening on Spotify, it's the book The Road to Eleusis.
The Road to Eleusis.
Eleusis.
The Road to Eleusis was originally published. It's written by Gordon Wasson, and we'll come back to him, and Albert Hofmann, of course, the discoverer of LSD and psilocybin, and Carl Ruck, a distinguished professor of classics at Boston University, and Blaise Staples, who was the Greek scholar who translated the Homeric hymn. And so this book came out in 1978. Now, 1978 was an interesting time in psychedelic history because it was really at the tail end of, we talk about the 60s, but of course the 60s went on into the 70s. By 1978, psychedelic drugs had become sort of passé. They exploded into our society in the early 1960s, late 1950s, really reached a peak around the mid 70s. Lots of chaos and hysteria about them. And then their use sort of petered out. And it was during this earlier period, which, as you'd said, Ben, that, you know, scholars and anthropologists and historians began to realize that when you look at the history of religion, in almost every case, in their myth of origin, in their cosmology, whether it's the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, or it's Jesus at the wedding feast, or it's the Eleusinian mysteries, or it's Soma, or the Mesoamerican stuff, there is a magic plant.
Yeah.
This is an extraordinary thing. And so a great deal of research was done on this, really showing that the world's religions, particularly the indigenous traditional societies, were all founded by mystical experiences from what we now call entheogens. But the case hadn't really been made that not only these indigenous societies, but our very own Western civilization, the religions, not only Judaism and Christianity, but the Greek culture. I mean, Greece is like the bedrock of our own society. And so this was a radical advance in the history of entheogenic scholarship, because it showed that our own society, ideas of like democracy and scientific method and the structure of theater, and so many of these things that we owe to ancient Greece were originally kind of, the great minds of ancient Greece all said that their initiation at Eleusis was the single most important thing in their life.
Yeah.
And so for Wasson and Ruck and Hofmann to come together and to identify this as something derived from ergot, which is the same source of LSD, was a radical proposition. But the book kind of fell on deaf ears. Again, psychedelics had kind of come and gone, and the book was published. Wasson, had a way of publishing books in a very expensive format. Book was hardly noticed by the world classical community or by historians, and it was a very small print run, and then it went out of print. And so I was when I dove into this subject and I learned about the Eleusinian mysteries and read this book, it was kind of a mind-blowing moment for me. And I thought that it would be extremely important to bring this book back into print. And so finally I did this in 1998. I had already developed a relationship with Gordon Wasson and with Albert Hofmann. And I had an idea back in the late 90s that I would bring this book back into print. And it would be the beginning of a legal effort to kind of redefine the Controlled Substance Act, to change the Controlled Substance Act, right? So the Controlled Substance Act in 1970 made all psychedelic drugs illegal for everyone, except for you'd have to go through expensive bureaucratic permissions and all this stuff. But the only exemption was the Native American Church, and they were allowed to use peyote. And there was an appeal in the mid-1970s by a group in New Mexico that said, well, look, if Native Americans can use peyote, then why can't we? Otherwise, that's discrimination. That's a racist, discriminatory ruling. And so the court, probably wanting to avoid another wave of psychedelic hysteria, ruled that there's no history in the Western white man's culture for using hallucinogens. That was a ruling in 1974 or 5. And then I read this book and I met the author. I met the man who ran that lawsuit, and I knew the authors, and I said, it's time to challenge that.
Yeah.
Because it's not only a racist ruling, it's also wrong. Because here's this scholarship. And so I got the copyright to the original 78 edition. And I brought this, I created a new edition. I got Houston Smith, who was a teacher and a friend of mine. You probably know, one of the world's preeminent scholars and philosophers of religion.
Legend.
And I had to write a preface to the new edition. And I added some more material to it, like the introduction of the word entheogen, a couple of chapters by Albert Hofmann about the meaning and relevance of the Eleusinian mysteries to today's world. And I had this book printed in Italy at the famous Stamperia Valdenega, where Wasson had all of his first editions printed. And I brought the book back into print. I had it reviewed in some scholarly circles, and I was hoping to start some fires about this. And once again, 1998 kind of fell on deaf ears. Nobody really picked up the banner until Brian. Brian saw this book in 2006, I think he said, and he thought, wow, this is crazy. And so he began to research it further and really elaborated and expanded the thesis into Christianity, which I have some issues with, but brought it up, and it became an immediate bestseller.
Mm-hmm.
Reviewed on, articles on CNN, podcasts, and everywhere. And the guy made $1 million, taking off on the work that I had started back, 20 or 30 years earlier. So that was very exciting for me.
Yeah.
It's interesting here. I just want to say this one more thing, because, when you take Brian's book, the very first thing he says in it here is that the most influential religious historian of the 20th century, Houston Smith, calls these mysteries the best kept secret in history. And this book, The Road to Eleusis, is the best attempt to unlock it. So that's really interesting. And I have this issue with Mike Crowley too, who wrote that book, The Secret Drugs of Buddhism.
Mm-hmm.
These drugs may have been secret for a good reason. And I think we need to look very clearly and discuss why we are telling this secret. Why are we violating this ancient code of secrecy and putting these things out before the general public? I like to explore that one.
Make sure y'all head over to benjosephstewart.com, become a member. You'll have access to the growing library of deeper dives where I talk about all the stuff that I really can't talk about on YouTube. Make sure you get involved in the Discord chat. That's where a lot of the conversation is happening, talking about new theories, being able to interweave into the greater conversation that is how we awaken infinity. That's our highest potential. And I just want to remind you, you are the most powerful technology ever known to creation. Wield it like an artist with a conscience.